how does another writer, how does loving a certain writer, loving his work, how does that play out when you write? Do you ever think of something that you've read in Cheever and then try to play off of that or use that? Or is it just kind of subconscious, just part of the base you write out of?
I guess for me, it's just, you know, a kind of a sense of joy of look what can be done. Look what can be done. And that's sort of the, you know, just always pulling the book to me and just thinking, look what can be done, look what he does, look what he does. And that's the first feeling. And then I guess underneath it's sort of, well, how does he do it? But that was never that specific to me. I mean, like I said, I did write out sentences and paragraphs. I just felt compelled to. I just loved his sentences, and so I just wondered, what does it feel like to write those? I knew I would never write John Cheever's sentences. I mean, nobody can, but I just sort of thought, what's it feel like to write those? The way you look at somebody that has a certain facial expression, and you think, what does it feel to have that facial expression? So you make it and walk around with it and think, well, this is what it feels, you know. So it's that kind of thing. But I guess for me, it's just as some kind of affinity and just joy that a sentence can do this. You know, that it's a relationship between. It just reminds you that this is a relationship, and that whatever sentence you put out is there for somebody to receive if they can.
I would say more than thinking of the story or trying to do something like he did or something. I just want to totally take him inside me and channel him. You know, it's there's an intelligence in the story that hits upon so many things that if you kind of keep him in mind, if you've encountered that sort of perception of things, it helps to sort of steal, or you know, to have it sort of support you somehow. It's
Do you feel like you've done that ever? Have you looked at something you've written and seen the hand of Cheever there?
Well, you know, when you asked us to think about the relationship of his work to maybe our work, I definitely, when I was reading this story, I was thinking in Monkeys and how there's one story in Monkeys that's very much about the father's drinking. And, you know, there's a scene that happens off screen that the mother describes, that the parents go to a dinner party and the father gets so drunk that he like drops his head in the plate and just says, this is so boring, and everyone like puts their coats on and says, it's time to go now, and then so that they can take the drunk dad to his car, and then they all get back out of the car and go back and finish the dinner, like this strange sort of saving face, and I don't know whether I don't think I would have. I don't know, something that seemed very Cheever-like to me, not that it came from him.
Rick? Well, let me frame it a little bit differently for you. You, of the three writers tonight, you've been directly compared to Cheever and fairly frequently. Obviously, you love his work. So that's probably something you find flattering, but do you also feel boxed in any way by that comparison, or that is unfair?
Well, I think people thought that the ice storm was Cheever-esque because of the milieu, not the writing. I never felt like, as Liz was saying, it's impossible to sound like him. Nobody is that good. Nobody's that talented. So I never felt I sounded like him. And so I often felt that there was a kind of prejudice involved in saying that I was Cheever-esque, because it was to say, if you wrote about the suburbs, that you were Cheever-esque. And I actually felt often that what was most influential for me in the work had nothing to do with the milieu at all, and everything to do with ideas of narrative and the empowerment of the late stories to narrate in very unusual and original ways. To always want to push narration out into terrain where it hasn't been before. To me, that could seem like an experimental fiction impulse, but to me it's totally consistent with the later work of Cheever, and that's where the influence was for me. So I actually think, sure, the Ice Storm comes from the same milieu as Cheever stories, but I've written a lot since 1994 that doesn't come from that milieu. And so I don't feel, at the end of the day, that that's the writer I would say was most influential for me. However, I felt totally empowered by this book and by a lot of his work, by the Watchshot Chronicle, for example, and Falconer, and the journals, and the letters. And it's really important for younger writers to find those voices that say, you can do anything that you want to do. Not imitate me and you will solve the key, but this reading experience tells you that you can do whatever you want to. And that was sort of what this reading experience was like for me.
Do you think you can start as Cheever, as a late Cheever, or do you think a writer needs to develop through that more conventional, realistic phase?
I always find that argument sinister. Because it's like saying you can't paint abstract until you've done the figure drawing. And to me, that's a rather conservative point of view. So I don't think that way, personally.
One thing I noticed, and this is for any of you, in every one of the stories you read, there's this authorial voice. You know, in the Sorrows of Gin, you're with that, now you're a girl, and all of a sudden, there's a step back and you get this observation about the world, this very profound observation. It's something I don't think a lot of writers do. Maybe I'm wrong, but how do you feel about that? Is that something that you've tried to do sometimes? Is just to take a step back and make some more authorial type of observations in your work?
I would say I've tried, and then I cross it out. It's hard to do it.
What do you think makes it hard? Just the audacity of it, or the power you have to have as a writer?
I'd say the power more than the audacity.
I think that's, I would agree that I've tried it, or I would love it, or I desire it, and you know, have not really, and just decided that's just not how I can approach, you know, the reader page. But I think that, you know, the question, what makes it so difficult is you've just got to be there from the word, you know, from the very first sentence. I mean, that's got to be your relationship with the reader, just right out there and willing to embrace them in that particular kind of way. But pointing that out, that sort of voice on the page, I think that has a great deal to do with, you know, my own personal addiction to him. That sense of somebody real, you know, allowing me to take part in just that paragraph that you read about, you know, the rainstorm, whatever, you know, when he, I mean, I don't really want to try and paraphrase it, but it's sort of like, oh, right, you know. You just put into words that thing. And that's just one of hundreds of things that he does.
Do you think that, would you call him a genius? I mean, would you say that what he has, what he does is something that no one could teach themselves to do, or that, you know, could someone get to that level through work and through desire, or do you think you have to have some kind of innate talent?
I would say he definitely got there through work. You just don't have it. You have to work it. So he knew how to define that thing in himself. that's genius, I guess, you know.
What do you think, Rick? You didn't like that question like it's out.
I just don't know what that word means. Do you want to define the word?
I would say genius is a gift, an ability that is inexplicable, that someone just has, and that few can approach.
Still not sure I know what it means. I mean, it's really interesting to me that John Cheever had very little formal education. I mean, that's fascinating. That this language came out of someone whose only primer was the classics is incredible. You know, nowadays we're so used to feeling that the guilds of the American writing workshop are the only route through which you can understand what fiction does in an insidery kind of way. But John Cheever is one of the great examples of somebody who absolutely came from outside the academy and had only his native interests as a guide. And that's totally singular to me. So if that's what we mean by the word, yes.
Did you have questions for each other? I mean, were there things you heard the other that you want to ask? Otherwise, I'll ask a few more, then we'll turn it over to the audience.
I was so excited to hear Worm in the Apple, which I totally forgot about. I mean, that's really beautiful. The compactness of it is fairly unusual for Cheever at that length.
There's a section in his journal where he asked that same question. Of course, I can't remember where it went, but it's very much with an entry in the journal where he's looking around the room, where John Cheever is looking around the room and saying, what can you do with a man like this who looks, you know, all this help is here, and yet, you know, I look only at the ashtray, and I look only at this man and think, you know, this nice looking man, and think only of this, you know, filthy sailor he's just done with, and what can you do with a man like this? And, you know, well.
But also that story is very much about writing stories.
Yeah.
Because at every turn, and like you say, he's including you in his intelligence. It's like, well, we all know that story.
Right.
It could have gone this way. And you're like, oh, but that would have been a good
Exactly.
You'd be happy to hear that story.
Exactly.
But, so he dispenses with the first version of a story that just assumes we even know which that could have been the story most people would, you know, and he keeps doing that.
Exactly, because even the you know, the big fate, like even knowing what the story is, as I read it again before tonight, like I thought there was this tiny part of me that, oh right, the big feast, she's going to get all screwed up because of the big feast, because he presents it, and we sort of know that story, the mother who hates the kid because she has, you know, but
Also, I noticed somebody got whacked over the head.
yes, I know.
Which is always fascinating.
He's always doing
Stuff
that.
comes back again and again.
It's so true.
There's like a little
true.
library of gestures, and they get reused constantly.
There's the gestures, there's, I think, names, last names that repeat, and there's, well, there's Larry, who was Lawrence in the first story, and actually that story is almost like a mirror opposite of Goodbye My Brother, because it's almost like he's trying to find what's bad, what's wrong. He's trying to find something.
And that's what that passage in Jewels of the Cabots is about too.
Yeah.
And I forgot to say this, but I mean, I assume this is obvious to everyone who is listening to it. But the beginning of the passage goes, children drown, beautiful women are mangled in automobile accidents, cruise ships founder, men die lingering deaths in mines and submarines. But you will find none of this in my accounts. Well, unless I miss my guess. They're already in his accounts. Like it's right there. And it's the same thing with a miscellany of characters who will not appear. You know, constantly saying this isn't in the work, but then the evidence is, in fact, it is in the work. It's all there.
It's always that little flip. Always.
For all his sadness, I think he has fun when he writes, and I think that is something that definitely comes out, that he's this playful sense. You find that?
He's got a sense of humor, certainly.
I always found him quite funny, and I remember giving the journals to some relative. She said, well, those are the saddest thing I've ever heard. I mean, I just don't even want to, and I took umbrage privately. And I really didn't know that they were the saddest thing. I mean, I actually thought they were quite courageous and uplifting and all this sort of stuff.
Sad
Funny.
doesn't cancel out funny.
No, it doesn't at all. It doesn't at all. But she didn't find it
Yeah,
funny, so I'm
right.
saying for her it did.
Yes.
But, so it was sort of like an entirely different viewpoint, like, oh, really? Because I find them very funny. Very uplifting, actually, because of, in the journals and stuff, always saying, keep it, pick her up.
Anybody in the audience have a question? Yes.
Yeah, I actually have a question about the passage you guys were just discussing, and it's the digression that you read. It sounded a lot. I mean, I guess his more biblical tone, his kind of brimstone pontificate intonation in that passage sounds alarmingly similar to Leander's. Leander from
Lockshots.
Lockshot Chronicles. Actually, I'm sorry, I lost the mental thread of what I was saying. Lost my continence, but I don't remember what the question was at all. It demonstrates that this kind of elliptical style was actually an early development of his. It wasn't something that he kind of happened upon later on when he deteriorated mentally or something, that with drunkenness and depravity. And so on. I don't care either. I don't care about it either. I'm not interested either. But just trying to place it within his artistic evolution or something like that, I guess.
Well, I think Liz was saying before that it's often Cheever's voice, that the narratorial voice, no matter from whose point of view it is, we can always feel a voice that's Cheever-esque, and that's part of what we love. So I think you're right to say that it sounds like Leander, but I think it's probably also accurate to say that Leander speaks with some of the slightly tongue-in-cheek fire and brimstone that's uniquely Cheever's. So for me, sure, there's continuity, but I would also say that there's significant refinement, and that later on he got by with less and less story and more voice, that the language sufficed after a point. And that's what's interesting to me, is to watch that progress happen.
Any other questions?
I was wondering what you thought of the story of the death of Justina.
Let's look, shall we?
We didn't know we had to read all the stories.
I haven't read it recently.
The death of Justina?
The death of Justina.
I can tell you how many stars I gave it.
I think I have a recording of him reading that.
Yeah, isn't that his reading voice
His reading voice
incredible?
was like so wild.
He sounds kind of like a Broadway singer, like Elaine Stritch. Yeah, it's like very feminine and very raspy. And he's got that whole like Newtonian Boston pronunciation thing.
Yeah.
I think he sounds like an actor playing a professor, kind of a fake, put upon accent.
It was interesting to hear it.
I haven't read this one in a while.
I
either.
can't answer the question because it just...
It's one of the Rome stories, and I will say that for me, initially, the Rome stories were a problem because I hadn't been to Rome the first time that I read the book, and so the symbolic heft of Rome, which is so central to those pieces, is totally lost on me. Now that I've been to Rome, they have much more weight than they did when I was
Yes.
So
So if you were going to put this to an artistic analogy, would you say that his earlier works, although they're extremely multi-layered and very subtle, would be more like realism as opposed to his later works would go into more impressionism, when you said that it's mainly done by words and not as much prose? Or no?
I mean, I find realism an extremely troubling word along with genius. So I don't know if I would say that exactly. I mean, I think the later stories are absolutely realistic. It's just a different kind of realism. You know, that we get boxed in with these definitions a little bit, and that's why the workshop gets used to only using a Hemingway or a Richard Ford or a Raymond Carver as an example of realism, whereas late Cheever, Nabokov, you know, Robert Cooper, John Hawkes, that all seems realistic to me too. So I think they become more linguistically rich, the later works to me, and more motivated by prose. And for me, that's important because I think that is my calling card to follow the language. You know. But he still had great ideas about narrative. That's what Sue was trying to say earlier, I think. And so even in these fragmentary shards that are
When
related,
you read.
there's still tons of narrating going on. It just happens in very unusual ways.
Thank you.
I think even his most conventional stories are unconventional, that he breaks out to one point or another in almost every story in an unusual way. It was pretty amazing to think that, you know, he was publishing in the New Yorker and that people were thinking of the New Yorker type of story and putting him in that box, which I don't think was entirely right. And that this book came out and was a bestseller, and all these people read it, when it's really simple and easy and rewarding, but challenging also.
The interviewer asked him, do you feel drawn to experiment in fiction to move toward bizarre things? He said, fiction is experimentation. When it ceases to be that, it ceases to be fiction. One never puts down a sentence without the feeling that it has never been put down before in such a way, and that perhaps even the substance of the sentence has never been felt. Every sentence is an innovation.
Very lovely.